Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Donc, bonjour. Je donne tout de suite la parole au bureau.
Judge Smotok, hello again. I shall give the floor to the OTP, Madame Sampson. You have the rest of the session, but I think that we shall interrupt you about 10 to 5, and you shall be speaking in the order that you gave us earlier on. So, Office of the Prosecutor, over to you.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Your Honors, I will now present the prosecution's evidence proving the crimes charged under counts 1 to 12 of the prosecution's document containing the charges. That is, imprisonment, torture, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, other inhumane acts, rape, sexual violence, murder, and attempted murder. In my presentation, I will describe the pattern and systematicity of perpetration of these crimes by the Mitiga perpetrators, and will summarize the key evidence proving the legal elements of these crimes. To prove these crimes for the purpose of the confirmation of the charges, the prosecution relies on the accounts of 47 former Mitiga prison detainees. For years, each of these survivors of Mitiga prison suffered unspeakable crimes at the hands of the suspect and members of his group. The accounts of these 47 witnesses paint a consistent and compelling picture, which places Khaled el-Hishri at the center of a machine designed to inflict extreme pain, deep humiliation, endless exploitation, and ultimately to destroy the lives of those detained at Mitiga. Your Honors, the following slides are confidential, and while we can remain in public session, I request that the visuals on the next slides not be broadcast to the public. These 47 detainees are men, women, and at the time of the charged crimes, children who observed Khaled el-Hishri and the other Mitiga perpetrators commit crimes firsthand, and in fact are some of the direct victims of Khaled el-Hishri's crimes. 45 of these witnesses were held at various times during the charge period, and many remained imprisoned after the charge period. The prosecution also relies on two former detainees who were detained just after the temporal scope of the charges. The 45 victims were held at the prison for periods from several days to up to almost the entire charge period of 6 years, running from May 2014 to June 2020. On average, they were detained for 2.5 years during the charged period alone. But again, as I just mentioned, many of them remained in prison at Mitiga for years after the charged period. The next slides and the remaining slides in my presentation can be broadcast to the public. Your Honors, while each of these 45 former detainees witnessed the crimes committed day in and day out by Khaled el-Hishri and the Mitiga perpetrators from their own vantage point, their accounts are corroborative of a consistent pattern of extreme mistreatment from arrest to release. The Mitiga perpetrators targeted victims predominantly in and around Tripoli, although their reach extended to well beyond. Some victims were arrested well over 100 kilometers away. They arrested the victims at their homes, in front of their families, including children, at their workplaces, in cafes and restaurants, or on the streets of Tripoli. They caught them at the airport or at roadblocks in and around the city. They used social media to lure them and abduct them or caught them at demonstrations. When the perpetrators could not find a target, they would detain their relatives, including women, children, and elderly persons, to pressure them to surrender. Wherever they caught them, the Mitiga perpetrators forced the victims into vehicles or otherwise took them away with violence, often at gunpoint, handcuffing, blindfolding, threatening, insulting, and beating them in the process. P-872 was shot, forced into a vehicle, and anally raped with a weapon before being taken to Mitiga. Masked men beat P-486 with the butts of their guns, insulted and threatened to shoot him before taking him away. This happened in front of his wife and child. The last thing he heard before being dragged away was his daughter calling for him and crying. The last thing she saw was her father covered in blood. They would not see each other until several years later. Your Honors, these are not the actions of a legitimate law enforcement agency. These are criminal abductions. There is no doubt that the victims in this case were imprisoned or otherwise severely deprived of their physical liberty. This crime is proven when perpetrators confine one or more persons in violation of fundamental rules of international law. For example, when they do so without legal basis or without providing due process guarantees. This is also the case, independently of any procedural violation, when they do so in conditions that are inhumane or inflict treatment that is incompatible with basic human rights protections. Whether or not some of the victims in this case may have legitimately been suspected of a crime does not matter. Because as your honors will hear throughout my presentation, from the moment they were arrested to the moment they were released, Khaled al-Hishri and the Mitiga perpetrators subjected them to extreme violence, held them in dehumanizing detention conditions, and deprived them of the most fundamental rights that must be afforded to any detained person. Following their arrest, most victims were taken straight to the Mitiga compound in the Souk al-Juma area of Tripoli, along the coastline around 8 kilometers east of the city center. Specifically, the perpetrators took the victims to the western part of the Mitiga compound. The victims were not told why they were being arrested or where they were being taken, and often only realized where they were when they heard the sound of planes landing and taking off from the nearby runway. Others learned that they were at Mitiga from co-detainees. And again, the manner in which detainees were treated on arrival at Mitiga makes it clear that their detention was arbitrary. The Mitiga perpetrators first took their victims to one of several support buildings, predominantly in the area presently highlighted in blue, which are collectively referred to in the prosecution's DCC as the Naklia. These buildings had rooms equipped for the specific purpose of interrogating and torturing detainees. At the Naklia, on arrival and subsequently, throughout their detention, the perpetrators interrogated detainees with extreme violence. They questioned them about their affiliation with militias or parties to the armed conflict, their political views, their moral and religious beliefs, their sexual orientation, as well as about relatives and acquaintances. Often, they were thrown accusations or were questioned in a way that made no sense, that seemed random or changed over time. They were not given access to a lawyer. Due process was non-existent. The perpetrators demanded ransoms for the detainees' release. They forced them to sign documents without knowing their contents. They extracted false confessions under torture. Some of these forced confessions were video recorded and later published online. Detainees were given scripts to read and were beaten if they weren't convincing enough. When P-1070 requested a lawyer and to be brought before a prosecutor, he was beaten with a hard plastic pipe called PPR and kicked in the stomach by a Mitiga perpetrator who told him, quote, "How dare you talk about a lawyer and question our procedures? We don't care about the prosecution. We are the rulers of Tripoli," end quote. Interrogators at the Naklia often seemed to know nothing about the persons they were interrogating. Many victims, still shaken and confused by their violent abduction, were asked to explain why they were detained or who had taken them to Mitiga prison. Yet, as P498 states, quote, "None of the detainees had a clear understanding of the charges against them," end quote. They were simply never told. At the Naklia, both on arrival and subsequently, the perpetrators, including Khaled al-Hishri, subjected the victims, men, women, boys and girls alike, to extreme physical, psychological, sexual, and reproductive violence to extract information, obtain confessions, punish, and coerce them into physical and mental submission, or to persecute them. This mistreatment at the Naklia amounted to torture, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, other inhumane acts, sexual violence, and rape. To inflict pain, Khaled al-Hishri and the Mitiga perpetrators used a broad variety of torture methods, techniques, and tools, following clear patterns, often combining them to maximize the suffering of their victims. Beatings and suspension torture were a common feature at the Naklia. After his violent arrest, P872 was immediately taken to the Naklia, where he and a female detainee were subjected to a form of suspension torture called farouche, which means grilled chicken. A visualization of this torture technique is currently being displayed on your screens. One after the other, they were forced to sit with their knees to their chests and their arms wrapped around their shins, their wrists handcuffed together. The perpetrators then lifted them with an iron bar inserted under their knees using a type of electrical crane called balanco. While suspended in this way, Khaled al-Hishri and others beat the two victims with hard plastic pipes for an hour. And Your Honors, all of this was done in front of the woman's young child. Suspension torture and beatings were often sexualized to increase the victims' suffering and their sense of absolute vulnerability. The Mitiga perpetrators often undressed, blindfolded, and suspended them before targeting their sexual and reproductive organs. One victim was being tortured in this manner when a Mitiga perpetrator inserted a metal wire through the skin of his penis, bent the wire in the shape of a hook, and ripped it out. An interrogator tortured P1685 with electrical shocks to his testicles while he was suspended in this way. He then pulled the witness's penis and punched him in the genitals, before another man took his turn to beat the witness, including on the genitals. An hour later, they were done with him. P1685 was still hanging by his hands. When he looked down beneath his blindfold, he saw blood running down his pants. Physical violence targeting genitals was a frequent feature of the detainees' ordeal at the Naklia. P667 and P942 were both violently kicked in the genitals. P942 describes feeling an electric shock throughout his body and his vision going hazy. He almost fainted and kept vomiting from the pain. Another time at the Naklia, an interrogator violently grabbed him by the genitals and twisted them, causing him so much pain that he fainted. P993 was tortured in this way by an interrogator who told him, quote, "I don't want you to have children," end quote. torture at the Naklia also included rape. During one torture session, an interrogator pulled down P635's pants, leaving him in his underwear, and pushed a hard plastic pipe into his anus. Another detainee was twice taken to the Naklia, where 3 men tied him up, bent him over and tied him to a table, undressed him, and anally raped him, one after the other. They then started calling him, quote unquote, sex slave, or Sebia. Following their initial interrogation and torture at the Naklia, the victims were transferred less than a kilometer away to the main prison building. Sometimes they were tortured so severely at the Naklia that they had to be carried or transported in a wheelbarrow. The main prison building covers an area of roughly 80 by 100 meters and is surrounded by a high perimeter wall made of reinforced concrete blocks, as well as by multiple watchtowers. At the prison, the Mitiga perpetrators initially took the victims to what was called the scanner room. There, they searched them, subjected them to humiliating and degrading body and cavity searches that frequently amounted to sexual violence and sometimes rape. Even if in some cases there may have been legitimate reasons to conduct searches, the manner in which they were conducted went far beyond what was necessary and was designed to be deeply humiliating, leaving a lasting impact on the victims. The Mitiga perpetrators forced many detainees to undress and made them bend over or squat. Some victims then had their anus and genital areas visually and or physically searched. Failure to comply immediately with instructions resulted in insults, threats, and beatings. Sometimes, the perpetrators used detainees to conduct the searches or conducted them in full view of other detainees, including relatives. The detainees who were forced to witness or carry out these searches are also themselves victims of sexual violence. Khaled al-Hishri was often present during the searches of female detainees in the women's section. He beat P665 with a hard plastic pipe before ordering her to take off all her clothes in front of him. When she hesitated to remove her underpants, Khaled al-Hishri warned. He wanted her to cooperate or he would search her himself. He then ordered another detainee to search her, including by touching her breasts and genital area while he was watching. The victim describes this experience as, quote, a humiliation that can never go away, end quote. Khaled al-Hishri subjected another witness, P943, to the same degrading treatment. He ordered her to take off all her clothes, threatening to beat her, calling her a filthy animal and a street whore. When she was fully naked, he instructed another detainee, a detained woman, to search her by touching her genital area, telling her, quote, down there, enter your hand, end quote. Again, Khaled al-Hishri was watching. P943 was terrified and thought that Khaled al-Hishri was going to rape her. Prisoners were then assigned to one of the prison's detention sections, each containing multiple collective or solitary confinement cells, situated just meters away from the prison administration. The evidence shows that at all material times, the prison held between at least 1,700 and as many as 5,140 detainees, including men, women, boys and girls, Libyans and non-Libyans. Here, throughout the charge period, the victims lived and died in dangerous, inhumane, and degrading detention conditions, in an atmosphere of terror and under the constant threat of barbaric acts of violence. Mistreatment happened everywhere, in the cells, in the corridors, and particularly in the inner yards separating some of the detention sections, and the outer yard immediately north of the prison. These yards were commonly referred to as laria, and like the naclia, they were equipped for the specific purpose of enabling the perpetrator's systematic use of torture. Violence started as soon as the detainees arrived at Mitiga. Khaled al-Hishri, quote-unquote, welcomed P-1673 to the prison by shooting him in the foot and ordering guards to beat him. Violence was routinely used as the detainees were moved around to punish them for resistance or simply for the entertainment of the Mitiga perpetrators. The Mitiga perpetrators inflicted beatings on all body parts, including the genitals, using their hands and feet, but also objects such as hard plastic pipes known as PPR, iron bars, or electrical cables. The suspect himself was well known for beating detainees with a shovel. P-1673 once witnessed Khaled al-Hishri chasing a prisoner with a shovel, holding it like an axe and swinging it forcefully. The suspect kept beating the victim until he could no longer move and left the floor covered in blood. A beating technique frequently used at Mitiga prison was called falaka. Guards, tied up, or otherwise constrained and lifted the detainees' legs before flogging them on the soles of their feet, their toes, legs, and buttocks, leaving them with blisters, lacerations, and bruises. To increase their pain, victims would sometimes be forced to run on their injured feet. Several times, P-93 was left in a corridor for hours with his feet passed through and tied to a metal fence. Any guard passing by beat him on the feet. When he was finally untied, he had to crawl back to his cell, unable to walk for weeks. Khaled al-Hishri, Osama and Jim, and the other perpetrators often punished entire cells or sections. While beating them, they sometimes forced them to the ground, kneeling or on their stomachs, or made them hold stress positions, such as squat, plank, or push-up. Or they made them roll over in the mud or over each other. P-719 describes how, on what was called, quote-unquote, Torture Friday, a Mitiga prison shift commander would take 25 to 30 detainees to a yard before telling his guards that he wanted, quote, to see the yard covered in blood, unquote. Another shift commander would call out around 80 to 90 prisoners to the yard and have his guards savagely beat them, all over their bodies while they were standing in the rain. The beatings lasted 4 hours. P-719 states, quote, "This was living hell. Torture was continuous in every shift and performed at their whim. The torturers considered this entertaining," end quote. Women held in the women's section were not spared from the beatings. P-733 states that Khaled al-Hishri, quote, "did not stop beating the female detainees until he saw blood," end quote. P-1722 saw him inflict collective punishments on groups of 5 to 15 women at the same time. He lined these women up facing a wall and then whipped them on the back and buttocks using the longest plastic pipe available so that he could hit multiple women at once. Once he whipped witness P-943 all over her body with a wooden rod while she was suspended from the ceiling, calling her a bastard, an animal, and a bitch. He especially targeted her breasts and buttocks while she was crying and begging for him to take her down. Khaled al-Hishri and the Mitiga perpetrators sometimes inflicted lethal beatings. P1722 and P1750 both witnessed Khaled al-Hishri beating detainees on the head, one of them with a shovel. Both of these detainees died. Another witness, P1720, witnessed Khaled al-Hishri and others torture a detainee over the course of several days. On the third day, the witness saw the detainee lying on the floor in an open area, severely wounded. He states, quote, "He had lacerations, blood, and feces on him. He was slumped to his side, unable to sit, and clearly required hospital care," end quote. This detainee died the next day. The Mitiga perpetrators, including Khaled al-Hishri himself, regularly took the detainees out of their cells to mistreat them, individually or collectively in the prison's yards. One of these yards was known as the Islamic neighborhood. This was a reference to the area of Tripoli known for its slaughterhouses and for the way butchers hang meat and the carcasses of slaughtered animals there. In this yard, Khaled al-Hishri and the other Mitiga perpetrators routinely suspended detainees on hooks from the gridded ceiling, often with their hands behind their back, and subjected them to severe beatings and other forms of torture. Suspension torture caused extreme joint pain, shoulder dislocation, cuts and lacerations in the wrists, and often lasting injuries, disfigurement, and physical impairment. P1722, who was suspended in this way by Khaled al-Hishri, stated, quote, "The pain was unbearable. I felt as though my body was split into two," end quote. While in this position, Khaled al-Hishri beat the witness on his back and shoulders with a metal bar. P942 was likewise subjected to this torture method, describes screaming before passing out. He said, quote, "I could feel my bones and my chest cracking. I could feel my muscles in my shoulders tearing apart," end quote. While suspended, the perpetrators beat the detainees with plastic pipes or pulled their legs to increase their pain. Khaled al-Hishri personally ensured that the torture inflicted on the detainees was as painful as it could be. Once, when he found several detainees suspended with their hands to the front, he personally proceeded to suspend them with their hands behind their back, before pulling their bodies down until their shoulders dislocated. P1750 stated, quote, "I cannot describe the pain and passed out. When I woke up, my arms were above my head, but the wrong way around. Khaled al-Hishri had pulled my body down, and my arms and shoulder had been wrenched and dislocated the wrong way. I was unable to use my shoulders for 6 months or more after this, and lost the use of my hands for some time." Some victims were partially undressed while they were tortured in this way, increasing their sense of extreme vulnerability and pain. Khaled al-Hishri and the Mitiga perpetrators sometimes left detainees suspended, tied to a pole, or chained to a wall until they died. P1736 once saw Khaled al-Hishri tie 2 young detainees with visible marks of beatings to a pole, instructing other detainees not to help them. After 2 days, when one of the men asked to be killed, Khaled al-Hishri replied, quote, "You are not worth killing. You will die here," end quote. And on the third day, both detainees died, one after the other. This was not an isolated incident, Your Honors. P720 and P1720 both witnessed the murder of detainees similarly left hanging by Khaled al-Hishri. Yet another torture method used by the Mitiga perpetrators was to shoot detainees, particularly in the lower limbs. Khaled al-Hishri himself shot at least 27 detainees. He ordered one detainee to sit on the ground, cover his face, and stop moving The victim then heard a loud bang and felt his body move backward. When he uncovered his face in shock, he saw a big hole in his leg. He could see his bone and it was bleeding. He states, quote, "I was in shock. I could not believe what had just happened. I was hysterical. I kept touching the blood with my hands and rubbing my eyes. I tried to stand on my leg, but I could not. El Hishri kept looking at me and insulting me, calling me a dog," unquote. Khaled El Hishri also shot to kill. P595, P720, and P1745 all witnessed Khaled El Hishri shooting and killing several detainees. One time, he fired a machine gun at an entire cell block, killing at least one and injuring others. He also shot P925 to kill him, but the witness survived due to circumstances independent of his intentions. Other detainees died as a result of the combination of being shot, beaten, and deprived of adequate medical care. Khaled El Hishri once shot a detainee twice in the legs, below the knee, and left him in his cell, returning there later that night to beat him. The next time El Hishri came to his cell, it was to collect the detainee's dead body. It was later found in the streets of Tripoli. Sexual violence and reproductive violence was integral to the Mitiga perpetrators' detention system. Khaled El Hishri himself inflicted sexualized torture on both men and women at Mitiga. He once pulled a man's pants down in front of a woman at the Naklia, grabbed the man's penis with pliers, and dragged him around, calling him a whore. Another time, he beat P1710 with a hard plastic pipe all over his head, chest, as well as in the genitals and on the buttocks. Many women and girls held under Khaled El Hishri's control in the women's section were subjected to sexual abuse and were raped. Shortly after P1736 arrival at Mitiga prison, Khaled El Hishri violently undressed her, pushed her face against the wall while grabbing her breasts from behind, and then anally raped her. P943 was suspended by her feet by Khaled El Hishri, who then beat her and touched her on the breasts, the buttocks, and in the genital area. He also punished a woman by twisting her arms, forcing her to lean forward before pressing himself and rubbing his penis against her, saying, quote, "You never learn, you never listen. What is wrong with you?" End quote. Men held near the women's section could often hear women screaming and crying. Khaled El Hishri, Osama and Jim, and the other Mitiga perpetrators raped dozens of women at Mitiga. Khaled El Hishri took women and girls from the women's section at night to a so-called leisure area in the Mitiga compound that was reserved for the use of the perpetrators. When these women returned to the prison, they told P1736 that Khaled El Hishri had raped them. Khaled El Hishri raped these women and children by force, threats, and coercion rooted in fear, violence, detention, and the abuse of his position of power within an inherently coercive and oppressive environment. One of these women, a minor, returned to the prison severely beaten all over her body. She had resisted Khaled El Hishri's rape attempts, and he had savagely beaten her. The Mitiga perpetrators raped men too. Male detainees were often taken away, isolated from the other detainees, and raped. One witness was left on his own in his cell when he first arrived at Mitiga prison. A guard came several nights in a row to rape him. The guard tied his hands, called him a dog and an animal when he tried to resist, and then anally raped him, one time with a water bottle. After being tortured, another detainee, P551, was left on his own in a cell when a Mitiga perpetrator came to orally and anally rape him at gunpoint, telling him, quote, "I order, and you're not in a position to refuse," end quote. Minors were sexually exploited by the perpetrators in exchange for food or a phone call to a relative. P595 once saw a boy who was crying hysterically while bleeding from the anus. The boy then told him that a senior Mitiga perpetrator had done this to him. In addition to raping and subjecting detainees to sexual violence, Khaled el-Hishri and the Mitiga perpetrators also deliberately exposed detainees to the risk of rape and sexual violence by other detainees. First, they knew that the deliberate overcrowding of the prison cells caused the detainees to sleep in such close physical proximity that it led to intra-detainee violence. Yet they maintained this system in place for years. Worse, they used detainees known for raping and sexually assaulting others by intentionally placing detainees in their cells as punishment. An interrogator once told P1673, quote, "I will put you in a cell where someone will rape you all night," end quote. Another detainee was moved to what was called House Zero as punishment. This cell was a cell that held detainees known for committing violence, including sexual violence against other detainees. This detainee was gang raped by 4 detainees in this cell. He cried out to the guards for help, but no one came. P498 states, quote, "If the guards wanted to torture someone, destroy him psychologically, intimidate him, to affect his dignity, they would place him inside this cell," end quote. Prisoners could hear people yelling for help and banging on the door of this cell. Khaled el-Hishri had the requisite mens rea for these crimes. Mitiga prison was characterized by the total control of detainees, an atmosphere of terror, widespread and systematic abuse, and absolute impunity. In such circumstances, rape and sexual violence were an entirely foreseeable and ordinary manifestation of the inherently coercive environment of the prison. In other words, at Mitiga, these crimes occurred in the ordinary course of events. Khaled el-Hishri knew that these crimes were being committed by virtue, among others, of his leadership role and regular presence at the prison. His central role in Mitiga prisons institutionalized mistreatment, and because he committed them himself against men, women, and children. Your Honors, these are just some of the many torture methods used by Khaled el-Hishri and the Mitiga perpetrators, and just some of the many specific examples described by the former detainees. Other forms of mistreatment used both at the Naklia and the main prison, amounting to torture, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, and other inhumane acts include asphyxiation, in particular through close confinement in a box sometimes described as a coffin for extended periods of time. Sharp force, for example, through the use of an electric drill on the flesh of a detainee. Amputation, for example, of most of the fingers on one hand. Dental torture and denailing caused by severe beatings on the face, the hands, and the feet of detainees. Burning. Chemical exposure through the gratuitous use of pepper spray in detention cells. Deprivation of essential conditions. Humiliation and degrading treatment. Threats and intimidation. Sleep deprivation. Isolation and solitary confinement. Sensory overload, and other forms of psychological torture. Victims were also forced to witness the mistreatment of others, including relatives, which itself amounted to torture. For example, Khaled al-Hishri often beat the women held under his control in front of their children. The children would hide between their legs, screaming and crying. He also shot a woman in the knee in front of her 13-year-old daughter. One particularly pervasive form of mistreatment inflicted by the Mitiga perpetrators consisted of the dangerous and dehumanizing conditions in which the detainees were held, and which permeated every aspect of their daily existence. These conditions satisfy the elements of the crime of torture, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, and other inhumane acts. Khaled al-Hishri and the Mitiga perpetrators did not simply deprive the victims of their physical liberty. They systematically denied the victims their basic human needs. They subjected them to starvation and dehydration. They denied them basic hygiene, adequate sleep, and necessary medical care. They left them without shelter, exposed to the cold or extreme heat. They confined them in unventilated cells devoid of natural light. They kept them in overcrowded cells, depriving them of any personal space or privacy, or alternatively subjected them to prolonged isolation. Some of them were held in secret for extended periods of time, leaving their relatives in prolonged uncertainty as to their fate and whereabouts. Many were deprived of any meaningful contact with their family members. They also deprived them of any sense of physical and psychological safety. And ultimately, by keeping them in these conditions, they took away their dignity. Your Honors, on your screens is displayed an image which, although not an image of Mitiga prison itself, was provided to the prosecution by survivors of the prison because it reflects the conditions there. Detainees were kept in small, extremely crowded cells for years on end. Detainees slept directly on the ground. There was so little space that prisoners had to take turns to sleep. One group of prisoners would sleep for a few hours while another group remained standing, waiting for their turn, often for hours and in difficult positions, leaning against the wall, standing in the toilet area, or on one leg among the sleeping prisoners, because there was simply no space left for their second leg. Those who were able to lie down on the ground were packed, quote, like in a can of sardines, unquote, sleeping on their sides, pressed by detainees on either side. One detainee's feet would be next to the other detainee's face. P1673 states, quote, there was no privacy. You could not move without touching the intimate parts of other detainees, unquote. Detainees became aggressive and often fought over space. Some were sexually assaulted by other detainees. On his first night at Mitiga prison, P571 was sexually assaulted by the detainee sleeping behind him and beaten in the face by the one in front of him. Detainees were also given inadequate and often inedible food, leaving them starving and malnourished. Prisoners became obsessed with food to the point of stealing small pieces of bread or fighting each other. Children and infants endured constant hunger. Detainees were also provided insufficient and unhygienic drinking water, including during the hot summer months. And because of this, many developed kidney failure and urinary tract infections. And some died from dehydration caused by acute diarrhea. Most detainees were held in squalid conditions. Wearing their only clothes, unshaven, detainees could rarely wash. They looked, quote, like they were living in a cave, end quote. Witnesses described their cells as dirty, never cleaned, filled with insects and covered in mold. They were hot and humid, airless, and smelled so bad that prison guards would often cover their mouths and noses when opening them, and called the prisoners, quote, dirty garbage. P486 states, quote, you would not keep livestock there, never mind human beings, end quote. Some cells had just one toilet, often just a hole in the ground, with no privacy, for up to 100 detainees. Some days after arriving at Mitiga prison, P54 was brought to a small, overcrowded cell, without windows or ventilation. When the guards opened the cell door, it released a cloud of foul-smelling vapor from the cramped prisoner's breath. The guards then kneed P54 in the back to push him in. P568 states that it was a relief every time the guards took him out in the corridor to beat them, because it meant that they could have some fresh air. Khaled al-Hishri often took personal measures to increase the detainees' suffering, for example, by switching off the ventilation system in specific cells to punish detainees, or prohibiting the removal of garbage for several days. Held separately in the women's section, in the same unsanitary conditions, together with infants and children, women were denied basic menstrual care. By forcing some of these women to give birth in these conditions without medical help, Khaled al-Hishri deliberately inflicted severe reproductive violence on these women. Your Honors, as a result of these conditions, disease was rampant in the prison. Prisoners suffered from tuberculosis, diarrhea, hemorrhoids, kidney failure, and many had scabies, rashes, and other skin conditions that made them scratch until they bled. There was little to no medical care for detainees, which compounded the impact of these detention conditions, and often made them lethal. Detainees were often dumped in their cells with severe injuries from their torture. Gunshot wounds, dislocated shoulders, broken bones and teeth, cuts, bruises, swollen body parts, including genitals. Or they were left there with life-threatening health issues, malnourished, and exposed to infections and diseases. Yet, the Mitiga perpetrators, especially Khaled al-Hishri, ignored and often explicitly refused to assist injured or sick detainees in distress. Guards would threaten to torture or shoot those asking for help, and even those helping other detainees. Prisoners were left to care for themselves. Prisoners subjected to suspension torture were often sent back to their cells with their shoulders still out of place. P54 describes seeing detainees with what looked like, quote, birth defects on their wrists and shoulders, unquote. Other prisoners would try to help them by stepping on their shoulders. P498 recalls, quote, we are not doctors, not nurses, but we had to do something to bring these people back to normal, end quote. In P925's words, quote, it was simply a matter of either recovering or dying, end quote. And in fact, many detainees did die in their cells, and often died a slow death. These deaths were not accidents, incidental, or isolated, Your Honors. This was murder. One day, P571 heard a gunshot. When he looked through his cell's window, he saw Khaled al-Hishri stand next to a prisoner whose leg was bleeding. Khaled al-Hishri then ordered, quote, dump him away and let it become infected, unquote. Prison guards often told detainees not to call them until a detainee was cold, meaning dead. P650 saw a detainee covered in blood, barely conscious, unable to speak, being brought to his cell. When the other prisoners called for help, the guards warned him that if they spoke up again, they would all be taken out to be tortured. 2 hours later, this prisoner died. Dead bodies were often left with the surviving detainees for long periods before being removed and dumped around the city with no formalities for identification. Your Honors, the Mitiga perpetrators also deprived the detainees of their basic sense of physical and psychological safety and made them live in a state of constant fear and terror. The perpetrators fueled this fear through their daily verbal abuse, humiliation, and threats of indefinite captivity, violence, and death. 2 guards showed witness 720 a wooden baton covered in blood and feces, and then threatened to anally rape him with it. P1710 was once told, quote, "You will leave this place wrapped in a blanket," end quote. Khaled al-Hishri himself once threatened to kill all detainees in the prison by throwing a grenade into each cell. Humiliation was a daily occurrence. While being beaten and insulted, P1673 was forced to bark like a dog and bleat like a goat. Others were forced to lick up their own vomit after being forced to roll on the ground. Insults such as dog or whore, or insults targeting parents and relatives are experienced as especially humiliating in the Libyan context. Your Honors, again, these are just some of the examples of the type of abuse that was part of daily life at Mitiga prison. Even when they were not targeted themselves, detainees could still see others being tortured, observe the wounded or dying prisoners in their own cells, or overhear the sounds of torture and human suffering throughout the prison. P595 described the sounds of Khaled al-Hishri yelling at and insulting the women who were begging him to stop beating them as, quote, terrifying and a daily occurrence. P650 confirms, stating, quote, "This was life in prison, hearing screaming, people crying and getting tortured, and not being able to talk about anything." Detainees were terrified of their name being called by the guards, as it meant that they would be taken out to the Naklia. P990 recalls, quote, "When a prisoner is called to the Naklia, they become petrified and go to the bathroom with diarrhea. Once you enter the Naklia, you either leave in a casket or with a handicap," end quote. Detainees were also terrified whenever Khaled al-Hishri was around. P1722 recalls that he and other prisoners in his cell would try to hide in the toilet, a space of barely 1 square meter, piling up on top of each other in an attempt not to be noticed by him and taken out for punishment. Detainees were held for years in these conditions without knowing their fate. Khaled al-Hishri once told P1736, quote, "Whoever comes here is a missing person," end quote. He often warned his victims that they, quote, "would not see the outside world until Libya had skyscrapers," end quote. That is, maybe in some distant future, or never at all. Most detainees were never charged or brought before a prosecutor or a judge. Some detainees were so desperate for a referral that they started a hunger strike. One of them recalled, quote, "We wanted to be brought before the Attorney General or die," end quote. Even for those who were eventually brought before a prosecutor, these decisions were made arbitrarily, followed no regular procedure, and were often based on wholly fabricated charges. When years into his detention, P942 was told that he would be brought before a prosecutor, an interrogator told him they, quote unquote, had nothing on him. MP 942 needed to speak, so he could be referred. When the witness said that he had nothing to say, the man suspended him with his hands behind his back and electrocuted him. When he was finally brought before a prosecutor, he was told that the many years he had already spent in the prison did not count, because the prosecutor had never been informed that he had been detained in the first place. Court decisions to release detainees did not matter. The Mitiga prison leadership, including Khaled al-Hishri and Osama Njim, they were the ones who decided whether prisoners could be released. As witnesses have explained, they returned many victims to their cells despite the issuance of a release order, which they refused to acknowledge, and sometimes simply tore up the release papers in front of the detainees. Release often came as a surprise. The perpetrators let many out of the compound without explanation, but with a warning that if they spoke about what happened to them, they would be imprisoned again. To this day, years after their release, the victims still do not know why they were imprisoned and lost years of their lives. Throughout the charge period, the mistreatment that I just described was the daily reality of thousands of prisoners, shaping every moment of their existence for years on end. The evidence shows that there are substantial grounds to believe that at least 945 identified victims were subjected to imprisonment, torture, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, and other inhumane acts, including 125 women, 770 men, as well as 50 children, including 13 girls and 27 boys. That at least 10 identified victims were raped. That at least 49 identified victims were subjected to other forms of sexual violence. And at least 89 identified victims were murdered or victims of attempted murder. Consistent with Your Honor's decision on the confirmation of charges in the Duterte case, these numbers of victims are non-exhaustive and merely illustrative of crimes charged in this case. Most of these victims were subjected to multiple crimes inflicted by Khaled al-Hishri and other perpetrators with extreme cruelty, often throughout a detention marked by never-ending terror. Madam President, Your Honors, this brings me to the conclusion of my submissions on counts 1 to 12. Tomorrow morning, our presentation, with your leave, will continue with the presentation on the crimes of enslavement and persecution by my colleague, Ms. Diane Looping. Thank you, Your Honors.
Merci, monsieur.
Judge Motok, thank you, Mr. van der Werf, for your presentation. So, this marks the end of today's program, and we shall resume tomorrow at 10 a.m. with the continuation of the oral observations on the part of the OTP. I thank the parties and participants, and I thank the court reporters, the technical staff, and all those who have made this first day of the hearings to come off without a hitch. Thank you very much.